Hello and welcome to the Questioning Behaviour podcast. My name is Sarah Bowen and I'm here with my lovely co-host, Merle to bring you more behavioural science straight into your ear holes.
Lovely.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the dummy that don't believe in science.
And today on this episode, we are going to be talking about, drumroll please, nudges. Again, public policy, behavioural science applications, and that little monosyllabic, catchy catchphrase that we've all come to know and love through this podcast.
Well, I mean, there's a divided opinion on this podcast team on whether we love the nudge, the sludge, the fudge. I mean, I do like fudge, so that's really not up for discussion.
Yeah, that's good.
But yeah, we're discussing nudges again, and I think it makes sense to do so. I mean, nudges, whether you like it or not, are I would argue one of the more mainstream parts of behavioral science, and as a result, maybe also one of the biggest areas of behavioral science. You're allowed to disagree with me always, but it's really interesting that that there's a lot of. Nudge obviously made very, very famous through its titular book, which captured the world by storm, and then loads of backlash and maybe disregard from people in the field of behavioral science or behavioral economics itself, because they do more stuff than just nudging, and now they're just known as the nudge unit, which I can imagine is not exactly how you want to end up. But I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, but we've had multiple conversations in which we have discussed policy, in which we have discussed nudging explicitly. Yeah. And today we're just going to get yet another perspective, because we're going to get the perspective from someone who I dare say is a bloody good expert in the field of actively applying nudges outside in the field. So very exciting to have her on the show today.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. I think we can't really have a conversation about behavioral science and ignore nudge completely. A lot of people's first adventure into behavioral science was through nudge and that sort of pop science avenue. It is a lot of what people think about. Maybe if you're not initially a behavioral scientist and you think about what is behavioral science, nudge is one of those things that pops up. So yeah, I'm very, very excited to speak to our guest this episode, who is, as you say, an absolute expert at crafting and designing experiments and doing research into this type of policy tool, and sort of expanding our knowledge beyond what works, but also into why as well.
Exactly. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Okay, so as I already mentioned, today we are talking to Christina Gravert, which I probably butchered because this is not my language. But Christina, please tell the audience, who are you, what do you do, and why did you pick behavioral science?
Well, thank you for having me today. So I'm Christina Gravert, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. And that's where I spent most of my time doing research on behavior change, behavioral public policy, and nudging, and teaching game theory, and now a new course on how to design field experiments. But then I'm also a co-founder of Impactually. You had my colleague, my co-founder, Nurit Nobel, on a couple of episodes ago. And together with her, we started a consulting company in order to bring behavioral science out into the real world, as you would say, as an academic.
Yeah, very, very nice tagline. That is the line we use. You are correct.
Impressive. So in terms of your research interests, whereabouts in behavioral science would you place yourself? What are you sort of interested in? Which behaviors are you interested in?
So in one way I would distinguish myself maybe from some other behavioral economists is that I do a lot of field experiments. I know those are also often the ones that we know outside of academia. But of course, behavioral science has a large share of people who work with modeling behaviors, also theoretical work, and I do a lot of applied work in the field. And there I'm particularly interested in the question of reminders, but also the possible negative effects that nudges or other types of behavioral interventions can have. So trying to understand what are possible spillovers that you might have if you nudge maybe one behavior, do you end up with changing something else at the same time. So trying to look at it from a more holistic perspective and also understanding how do different nudges potentially influence different types of people in different ways.
Cool. We've spoken a little bit about nudges on some previous episodes, and we've always ended up being a little bit, I guess, confused about what a nudge is and technically how different people define them and how they're used and the sort of, are they, I guess, the best policy tool to be using? Is there anything else beyond nudges that behavioral science can bring to public policy? So I guess a question to start with is, how would you define a nudge, and where do you fall on the nudge is a good tool or nudge is a sort of a tool we should be moving away from scale?
Mm-hmm. So I think what's often interesting when I talk to people outside of academia or outside of being somebody with economics training is that they always have this idea that you define nudge by what it is. Well, I think originally it's more that nudge was defined by what it isn't. So nudge, I would say, are all these things that matter in our environment for changing behavior or in a decision architecture, but do not fall under rules and regulations, or maybe increasing the choice set or decreasing the choice set, which do not fall under incentives. So this is either rebates or a lottery or giving money or taxes, so which would affect behavior, and which also do not fall under the category of rational information in the sense that I just didn't know that maybe something wasn't so good, and then I get told, and then I change my behavior because I now update my beliefs about how important it is. And then I would say, in a way, nudging falls under everything that's left over, which to the rational economic being in an economic model shouldn't matter. So these might be things like, as we said, social norms or inattention, because the perfect rational actor is fully attentive if this is an important question, and also they shouldn't really care what other people believe about them. But then we do see that these things matter in decision making when we look at the empirical data. And so for me, nudging is really this category of these things that are left over, but which is sometimes a hard way to define nudging because it's defined by what it isn't rather than by what it is. And I think when it comes to using nudging as a policy instrument, again, it's very hard to say, okay, this is particularly a nudge, so this is good or bad, but it's more to say, okay, if these three classic policy instruments, the rules and regulations, economic incentives, and factual information, if they aren't enough to get behavior change going, or if they don't seem to be working in this case, is there maybe something else that could affect behavior? So you could also say, if you take the system 1 and system 2 thinking, I say, well, I mean, our system 2, the rational and deliberate logical one, that's affected by these classic policy instruments. And then nudging kind of goes at the system 1, these fast decisions. Or you might also say that nudges in a way can be corrections for a particular bias we have. And again, when we want to think about applying nudging, there needs to be a bias first in some way in order for us to use a nudge to counteract that. Mm-hmm. Or in some cases, but I guess those are a bit more on the ethical outside spectrum, to say, well, how can we use potential biases that we know people might have in order to use that then to nudge them towards something different? But I think with those, we need to be quite careful. So I do prefer the classic nudging for good. We think people are making irrational mistakes, and then a nudge can help correct for those.
All right. That's pretty clear, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, the concept of nudging for good, I've always found quite fascinating, and behavioral scientists and economists tend to have strong opinions one way or the other about this nudge for good concept, because I guess there's an assumption that someone has to be making a decision that you would be better off by choosing something else and sort of pointing you in a certain direction with that change in choice architecture. So is there a way around this ethical concern, I guess, is my question?
Yeah, so I guess the thing is that for me as a behavioral economist, really, nudging is a policy tool, and policy tools by definition should try to improve the welfare of the citizens of a state. So there's not so much the question, is this good or bad, but it is something that, yes, as long with rules and regulations, economic incentives and information, it should be in the interest of the citizens. Whether this is necessarily always in the interest of each individual person in that state, let's say, that's not always going to be clear. For example, if we think about recycling, whether it's in my best interest today to recycle my trash, maybe I don't feel like it, but in the long run, it reduces taxes, it's good for the environment. So I think there is also some value in using policy tools to, as we would say, reduce externalities on other people. And that would also be maybe living healthier lives to reduce health insurance costs in the long run, and these type of questions, which are good for the individual in some sense, maybe not in that right moment when they're doing it, but in the long run, and in that way also beneficial for society. And that's really where I think we should focus on nudging. Now, that said, now that nudging has become such a popular concept, we see more and more private organizations and other actors trying to use these tools as well for their interests. And I think what I also often say is that, well, if it's just about increasing profit, then why call it nudging? Then you can call it marketing, or you can call it in some other way behavior change. But to me, nudging is a policy tool. And if you could consider a company as like a micro state, you might also want to use nudging for good, in the sense that you want healthy employees, you want them to show up for work, which is good in the long run for your profits if your employees are happy, if they do training, if they behave in a good way, if they submit their tasks on time. So then you can again think about nudging within that, but always with that thought in the back that it is about increasing utility of the ones you are nudging.
Okay, so almost reserving the term nudge for really when we're talking about public policy and talking about reducing externalities on people. Okay, interesting. I like that.
Yeah. Or reducing internalities, of course, right? So that could be this, I want to lose weight, so I'm not going to eat the cookie. So then we would say that's an internality, which a nudge can help with. There's some people might say, okay, but how do we know for sure what you want, right? Is what you want today and what you want in the long run? Like who's the one who should say whether you should get a nudge or not? Is it me who wants the cookie now? Or is it the future me who wants to look good in a bathing suit or something like that down the line? Which in that way, that's actually easier about reducing externalities, because there it's quite clear, right? Reducing, any type of, prohibiting climate change in some way, recycling trash, or not taking the car into the city or something. That's very clear then what the benefits are for the individual and also for society.
Fair enough. Talking on the topic of benefits, because something I always find very interesting with nudging is that sometimes a nudge in and of itself, which you think will have, good consequences, because that's what you're aiming for, ends up maybe having the desired consequence, in the best of times, but ends up having some spillover effects, as you've already mentioned yourself, which weren't entirely accounted for, and sometimes they're positive and sometimes they're negative. But have you, because you said yourself you run studies in the field, have you come across these yourself and in your own work, and were these positive or negative spillovers?
Exactly. So first of all, I think we're still lacking a lot of research in that area. So I think there's a lot of nudges we see where we don't even look for potential negative spillover. So they're just not measured. So they might be there even though we don't see them. In my own research, we looked at sending reminders for donating to a charity. And these were people who had signed up to be on the list and who had donated before. So we assumed that they were interested in donating again. But what we also saw is that every time we send a reminder, or more reminders we sent, more and more people unsubscribed from the mailing list, which gave us an idea that this is in a way a revealed preference for, not being reminded or not being nudged. And that then also triggered some more research trying to understand, okay, what is it about this that we don't want to get reminded? Because you could say, it's not such a problem to delete the email, but actually going through the trouble of unsubscribing. And I think sometimes also when it comes to social norms, you sometimes see boomerang effects where people say, oh, everybody's doing this, and then people might intentionally do something else. So those are maybe almost direct spillovers effect that are quite easy to measure. But you could also imagine things such as nudging people to eat vegetarian at lunch, and then you don't know what they eat at dinner, right? So you might have this moral licensing effect that is like, oh, now I had such a healthy salad for lunch, and now I'm going to have a big steak for dinner because I was such a good person at lunch. In one study we did on a restaurant where we did this nudge to get people to eat more vegetarian food, we wanted to see if they ate more dessert, because I was in them, and we didn't find anything there. It was just too few people were eating dessert at all. So we don't know if it would have had an effect.
Very healthy
but
bunch.
Unfortunately, of course, we couldn't observe these people having dinner.
That's really interesting.
Yes.
That's super interesting. Okay, so, I mean, if you were, or I was, for example, to run a study, I had a nudge intervention, I had sort of my outcomes of interest and an idea about what to look for to try and track the effect of the intervention. How might I build in measures to get a better idea of the actual welfare effects of the nudge, beyond maybe just asking people, is this annoying or is this helpful? Are there any other ways that we can measure sort of, how people are responding to the nudge?
Mm-hmm. So I would say there's probably two ways of doing it in the literature right now, or that are the most prominent. So one is the approach of a willingness to pay structure in there. So you probably know the study by Hunt Elcott, where he was looking at O-Power, the home energy reports. We've all heard that before. People are getting these reports. But I think what has not been talked about so much is that they actually did a follow-up study where they sent people, in a way, $10 coupon, and then they said, so you can either keep the money or get more of these reports. And then they varied that, changing in a way the price of how much these reports would cost to them. And then they could see whether people would actually be willing to pay money to get them. But even the other way around, they're like, okay, you can only keep the money if we get to send you reports. So that then also gives you a measure of saying how much are people willing to pay to not get them. And with that, you can get these negative effects out. So it's not that it's zero, but they actually dislike them so much that they're willing to give back money, these $10, just to not get any more reports. And that's also a measure that we then used for a study on medication adherence, which I ran last year in South Africa, where we're looking at medication adherence reminders, where we then also asked the women, we also gave them credit for their phones. And then we said, so you can either keep the credit or you can get the reminders, or even you can in a way pay to not get reminders anymore. So that's one aspect of doing it. So this revealed willingness to pay with actual incentives. And then the second way is what I was talking about earlier, was these unsubscriptions. So that's then a revealed preference measure. So we see people are selecting out of the situation by unsubscribing from the mailing list. There is some cost to doing this compared to just ignoring it. So from that, we then can also back out that people are disliking this. So one is this more revealed preference approach about some kind of counter action, and the other one is this willingness to pay structure. And then, of course, you can also ask people about it. But I would say those are the kind of main scientific ways of doing it and how it's being done recently in studies.
Really interesting.
Oh, that's pretty clear. So I know for the study that you did in South Africa that you sent different reminders. So I know that there were in total 6 conditions, of which 5 were actually in the paper we're currently discussing. Yes, I did read this properly. And I was just very intrigued to find the result, because you had several conditions, and one of the conditions in which you just provide people with extra information just doesn't work at all, and actually it backfires. So people just do not want extra information, it seems. But I thought, so obviously within, I think at the very start of the behavioral change literature, I think a lot of people were just like, we can improve decision making if we just inform people about what they're doing and what the overall effects are of the choices that they're making. But with the reminder that you've found, that you've, studied, this seems to be the opposite. So do we now currently have an entire behavioral change sector, which is just looking at providing people with information, which is just, having completely adverse effects? Because this is something that I think I would have liked to have known 10 years ago.
Yes. So I don't think we should never take one study and then make general conclusions out of it. So I think that's it's one piece of the whole thing. And of course we're surprised that when we just sent basic reminders, which just said, please remember to take your medication. Good morning, take your medication. Hello, have you taken your medication? These reminders were actually effective, and also the women seemed to like them based on our willingness to pay measure, and also they did not select out of them. So they were having both of those measures in one experiment. But when we added information such as don't take the pills together with coffee or tea, or make sure to eat vitamins, or take other vitamins like vitamin C, we found that on top had a negative effect. So the reminder still worked, but the information, the marginal effect of the information was negative, which we found quite surprising, given that, for example, older studies by Dean Carlin, they did something on reminders and goals for saving. So they sent basic reminders. They sent reminders where said, oh, remember to save because you wanted to buy a bicycle. And there we actually see there was a positive effect of these, for example, goal setting and additional information. But what I think could be going on here, and this is also in our theoretical model in the paper, is that we said, well, the information probably works if the beliefs are quite low that this is important. So if we're shifting beliefs about how important it is to take this medication through this information. So that would be one explanation, because we find that the beliefs are already quite high at the start. So most women do think it's important to do this. Well, that might be different in other settings, that people actually have much lower beliefs, and also where I think information can be very valuable, where then it might also not be nudging anymore, as I said earlier, about the information kind of rationally changing your beliefs about the importance of something. And that's something we find in there. So I think as a learning from this, we should think about, okay, how much do we already think people know about this, or how important do they find this? And if they already probably have quite high beliefs, that's also what we see with these social norms, not just maybe not working in many cases, is that people already think most people pay their taxes, and that actually doesn't have a big effect and might actually hurt it. Now, what exactly hurts it? That's a bit hard to say in our situation. We can't get it out from our study, but I think a good learning is that, and there's also 2 or 3 other studies that I found that also had this problem, that once they added information to the basic reminder, it actually had a negative effect. So that maybe if I'm not 100% sure that this information is super valuable here, maybe rather just leave it out of the reminder, especially when we have these repeated reminders that come every day or every couple of days, because people might find it annoying. And then as a second point, and this is more of a practical issue, it's much more expensive to make these information reminders than the basic ones, because we had to work with a team of nutritionists and had to go that to the IRB so that we wouldn't be saying anything, especially in this medical case, something that would hurt women or somehow be wrong information or could be misinterpreted. So that was a huge deal to get these messages. Well, good morning, remember to take your pills. That was very clear. So actually it was much cheaper to do that first part. So my recommendation would be, unless you're really sure that this information helps, maybe just leave it out.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a clear case for the cheaper solution actually being the more effective one. So truly a nudge. Actually, on the topic of beliefs, so I've been doing some more reading lately on the behavioral change topic. So I know to some extent now, also thanks to your clarification, what a nudge is. But recently, when it comes to messing with belief systems, I've been getting into the topic of budging. So is that something that you have an interest in yourself? This going beyond altering behavior and the choice context and actually starting to influence the underlying belief systems? Because you did mention beliefs already, so this must be an avenue that you've looked at already.
So it's not something that I've looked at in particular here. I think there's maybe budging or boosting. So this sometimes also comes from this idea that, is it more ethical if we give people the information that they need in order to change behavior, rather than nudging them, which some people might find is a bit sneaky in ways. I disagree, because I think if you follow the rules, then that shouldn't be such a problem. And also nudges don't need to be secret the way that they're often made out to be. But I think it is, yes, changing beliefs can make a lot of sense. And I think there's definitely ways of how to do that. There's a lot of interesting research showing under which circumstances maybe particular information treatment changes beliefs but doesn't change action, and sometimes it changes beliefs and it does change action. So another study that I worked on in a laboratory setting is where we look at whether if their confidence changes, do they also then choose different types of tasks where they could make a higher earning, but only if they were actually quite good. So it can be detrimental to them to believe that they're so good. And I think there's still a lot of research that needs to be done, really, how changing beliefs changes actions or how it doesn't change actions. Because in the very basic model, we often assume if beliefs change, action has to change. But I just think there's a lot of evidence now that that's not necessarily the case. And I think it's still missing to know, okay, under which circumstances is that important or is it not important?
That's really interesting. I've never heard of this like budging term before. I mean, I was sort of under the impression that a lot of behavioral change interventions, they sort of already work or are intended to work through the mechanism of changing people's beliefs or changing people's sort of motivation. So yeah, interesting that there's another sort of nudge offshoot sort of being carved out. I mean, that is the thing, isn't it? There's been so many like children of nudge. I don't know whether it's just because people like something that's like monosyllabic and catchy, and people will click on an article like sludge and stuff like that. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's where we're going. Maybe it's just, further in conversation.
Yeah. I think, like I said at the beginning, where I think nudging is just everything, the other things aren't. I'm not sure I'm so keen on like all these sub-classifications in a way.
Yeah.
I think there's ways that change behavior. You might be able to change people's preferences. That's still debated. Like, do we change our time preferences? Like, if we do a grit intervention and children in school learn how to be more patient, is that something that can be of a long-term impact? Then the question of beliefs, like how can we, through information, change beliefs, and how does that impact behavior? And then obviously the choice set, which would be okay, if we offer them other things, are they then going to choose other things? But I think that, yeah, it's maybe a way to make it accessible outside of academia. I don't think that in my research is something, this question of budging or boosting or something, is something that I would say is very relevant, because it tries to put things into a category, which I think it's unnecessary to put it into that type of category, into such a narrow category. But yeah, the question of how we can change beliefs. But I think one thing you just said about whether nudges should change beliefs, I think that is only for probably not so many, and maybe not even that case. For example, if we take reminders again, we say in our theoretical model, well, a reminder can work in 3 ways. It increases attention to a problem. It might change beliefs about how important a problem is, or give additional information, and that might change my beliefs. And it can have some kind of moral utility in the fact that you remind me that I didn't call my grandmother for her birthday, or that I still haven't sent in some questions I was supposed to send in. Then it makes me feel guilty, and then that triggers the behavior change. But if we separate these things out, and that's what we do in the study, is to say, well, actually, the fact that a reminder if it's only there to trigger my attention, then it shouldn't change beliefs, because all it does is shifts my attention from one thing to the other. And I shouldn't be any different 2 seconds later than I was before. And also, that should not have any negative consequences necessarily. Well, if I tell you that you're the only student in class who hasn't done X or something, it might actually create these negative costs, which could affect my behavior, but then it might come at a different or much higher cost than just the fact that I remind you that you haven't submitted your homework yet.
So in that case, if I want to change someone's belief about themselves and as a result change their behavior, what I'm essentially doing is I'm either guilt tripping or shaming them. This sounds quite negative. This sounds like a very negative emotional trigger. And yeah, that is not necessarily great.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think we want to be very careful if we can. And that's also what we're trying to look at into study, or a lot of my research is about how can we design nudges in a way that we don't have to necessarily use these negative aspects. Like if we find that a reminder, as we see in the study, is actually the biggest part of behavior change comes from just the attention part, and then the other stuff is on top, and in one case even a bit negative. It's like, why do we need that? And I think people might get excited about it sounds fancier. I mean, we all know the Cialdini towel study, where they say, oh, this many people in the hotel also reuse their towels. But if we're honest, the biggest part comes from the fact that there is a reminder to reuse the towels, and then there's an additional effect from the social norm in this case. I think it makes a lot of sense in this case because people probably don't have correct beliefs about how often people do this. And so that's another question. But still, the biggest behavior change we probably get is just from the fact that there's a reminder and not from the rest. So that is also something we should look at. And recently I saw a new study where they looked at 45 different tax social norms experiments. So comparing them in a meta study, and I think it's really nicely done. And they also find that a large part actually comes more from the reminder aspect, and actually the additional social norms and other types of messages, they give a tiny effect, and most of it, so no social norms they don't find to be significant at all in the meta study. They find that deterrence effects are saying that, oh, if you don't pay your taxes, you might go to jail. So those who highlight the consequences, they have a significantly negative effect on top of the reminder. But again, it's quite small compared to the reminder effect.
Fair enough. It's actually really interesting that you mentioned the towel study, because it's the towel study that got me into budge and looking into what budging was, because that study, so the original study is American, and then one of the replications, which became famous because it massively failed to replicate, was done in Germany. And the reason that people started looking into budge is because, there was just a complete failure in realizing the context, and specifically the contextual differences between the American and the German population, where the American population, they nudged, I think, from towel usage between like 30 to 40%, actually getting it between 70 and 80%, so a massive increase. So, I mean, good for them, good stuff. That's exactly what you want a nudge to do. But then in Germany, they realized that didn't work at all, for the simple reason that towel reusage was already between 70 and 80% in Germany. So this seems to be the max what that nudge can reach. And once you're at that level, there's just nothing more to do. So I thought that was really, really interesting. But yeah, it's an interesting one. So there seems to be a ceiling effect to nudge. And of course, always the effects that, the nudge where people who are told that they're doing super well in energy consumption and just not using that much energy in comparison to their neighbors suddenly start using more energy because they've been doing oh so well. So I always find this stuff just great. This is the woes of nudging, the many woes of nudging.
And it's interesting because there seems to be a difference between nudging with words and nudging without words. So like just, changing something and not necessarily, giving people information around it. So whether that's just changing the position of items on a shelf, or whether it's in or not within your eyesight, or adding a message, on the shelf which says 90% of people bought this item, or something like that. I mean, is that one way you could think about the difference between nudges or types of nudges?
Yeah. So in one article we wrote about nudging as an environmental policy instrument, but it also applies to other areas, but this was particularly about environmental studies, is where we discuss pure nudges versus more moral nudges, or nudges that create some kind of psychological utility and are additive to the situation. For example, if you think about defaults, most of the time there has to be a default, right? One thing is the default. Or if you think about the menu study we did, some dish needs to be at the top of the menu and some needs to be at the bottom of the menu. And if you change those around, we know it has a psychological effect on choosing what's at top, but the person at the moment of being nudged, they're not realizing this is a nudge. And there's also no moral utility or disutility happening, right? It's not saying, oh, be a good person for the climate and eat vegetarian, which could then lead to a negative reaction or a positive reaction, right? If you're a vegetarian, you might feel good about that. So I'm not saying it's always negative, but it creates some psychological utility at the point of time of being nudged. Same with a reminder, which is a bit of a, double-sided thing. So part of it is just the attention, and then part of it is the moral aspect. But something like social norms messages are usually always on the moral side, right? They're not naturally there. And then there's again some things that are more about the infrastructure and design, which you might not notice. So particular types of framing of options that are available, like you said in the supermarket, how things are placed, are not things where I think about that I'm being nudged. even though we know that on the aggregate it will have an effect. And when I talk with more my practitioners, the ones that I give courses to, we also kind of think about nudges that are encouraging nudges or nudges that are in addition, and then these nudges that are just changing something that's already there. So there we say, okay, reframing something is something that's already there and presenting it differently, or facilitating, maybe I'm taking away hassle costs, making it a bit easier, or putting the vegetarian food at the beginning of a buffet line. But then encouragement nudges are everything that's feedback, social norms, reminders, commitment devices, these types of things where I'm adding something to the decision environment. And those are the ones that are, maybe from an ethical perspective, some people feel better about them because they're like, it's clear that somebody's being nudged because it's clear that there's a message here. So I know something is happening. But on the other hand, they can also have that tendency to have that negative effect on some people. Well, with the other ones, you're not aware that they're there, but that also means that you might not have this negative reaction to it, but also not the positive one. So I don't think there's a clear better or worse, but depending on what you're trying to optimize, if you want to be very transparent, you might want to go for the ones that are obvious, even though they might have these negative effects. But on the other hand, you could also say, well, the ones that are already there and I'm just shifting them to be more beneficial for the citizen or the individual, those are better to use than the ones that I add on top of onto the decision environment.
I'm interested in this idea of the welfare impacts of nudges, and sort of, I guess it's more of a philosophical question, but how do you weigh the welfare effects like versus like the outcome effectiveness of a nudge? So if you have, a nudge that when you look at the outcome, it does what you wanted it to do, it improves the behavior by a certain amount, but once you've sort of measured welfare effect, you can sort of see that overall there's a net negative welfare effect, that people don't like the nudge, but it works. What do you do in that situation? Is it a sense of one, in this sort of, taking into account the welfare effects, obviously, of the outcome as well, but it just seems like a complicated equation in my mind of how to solve it.
I think you're completely right. I think it is very complicated, and this is not just about behavioral science or even experiments, right? This is within all of economics. A big question is, right, how do we evaluate welfare effects? Should we be adding happiness to our indicators or something, how well a country is performing? I mean, that would be a typical welfare question as well, right? Is it just GDP, and does it need to be GDP growth, or should it actually be happiness growth, or those type of things, right? So I think that's a much more general question than just behavior change. So many people who are really smart are thinking about this. So I think personally, it is interesting to see what are the parts that you want to add to your welfare estimation. So, right, you could think about it just from the perspective of the individual people being nudged, and then you could say, well, I mean, it might feel a little bit unpleasant to get reminded to do something, but then I get quite a large benefit of actually doing it. So that's worth it. So if you think about it in an experimental setting, there's a nice study by former colleagues of mine from Gothenburg who were sending reminders to go to the gym to people, and they found that about 10% more people went to the gym. But then what about these 90% of the other people who also got this reminder to go to the gym and didn't go to the gym? So did they feel bad about it, or did they just not care, or did they just get annoyed with it?
Or were they already at the gym?
Were they already at the gym? Yeah, they could figure out. So some people obviously already went to the gym, but then let's say the 40% who just didn't react to it. So should we be taking those into consideration? I think yes, when it comes to these types of nudges, because they might have these negative effects. But for example, in our study where we tried to estimate this and did a welfare calculation, we said, well, I mean, people get a bit annoyed with donating, but other people wouldn't have donated had they not been reminded. So what is like we would call in the literature is called warm glow, right? So what's the good feeling you get from donating, and how do we measure that for those people who did donate, and how bad did those people feel who got the email but then didn't donate? So that you could equate. And that's one component of the welfare analysis. And then you have the other side, which would be the charity, right? So they now get money from these people, so that there's some value being created there. But then they lose people because they unsubscribe. So that's kind of a cost-benefit transition for them. And then something we don't have in the paper as a calculation, but which you might think, well, $1 from a Danish person who was nudged to donate, if that now goes to the African child that this campaign was from, right? The increase in their welfare, that how much value they can get from that $1, which the Danish person doesn't have now, and maybe the little bit of feeling guilty for having to donate, maybe that is worth so much more than kind of the annoyance factor there. And if we compare that, for example, to climate change, saying, yeah, I might feel a bit bad if people keep telling me to recycle or to take the bicycle. I mean, I might be getting some health benefits from it as well if I'm biking instead of taking the car. But then also, what are these long-run effects for our climate? And should we be considering those? And should we be considering the welfare of somebody who maybe lives in India if I take the car every single day and have these effects on the climate? And how do we calculate that in? So as you can see, I mean, it can get very big.
Yeah.
And the question is like, where do we draw the line about, saying, well, this is good or bad? And yeah, those might be the different steps you want to look at.
I'm already overwhelmed. I love this because it reminds me of a conversation we've already had with Nila Saldana, where we very much looked at like the cost aspect of integrating a nudge. But like to me, nudges, they were marketed as like very easy, cheap, quick. And just the more I hear about people who are, or from people who actively apply nudges, this is not that cheap. I mean, we discussed this with Neela, and like having to overhaul your company structure or having to overhaul an entire product or service to make it fit behavioral change is not cheap at all. And then the quickness of this, I'm starting to doubt as well, given how long these processes take. And then just, it's not that simple to implement either. So like I'm impressed. I'm impressed with your work. I think your work is great, especially the amount of impact it does seem to have. But I'm just like this. I feel like nudge has been missold to me. I think it's been missold to me as to how cheap and easy and fun and cutesy it should be. I think it's as a policy tool. Yeah. It's probably easier than, because obviously I'm not in policy and I don't know. But I feel like if the rest of policy is already loads more difficult than this, I don't think I'm ever gonna get into policy.
Well, I think it could be actually much easier. So we discussed this also in the paper where we classify the nudges about taxes versus nudges and trying to think about, okay, what are actually the costs of implementing a nudge? And I mean, yeah, in some cases you might not need to pay a lot of money because if it's just rewriting a letter, but you actually need to figure out how to rewrite that letter in a better way so it's going to change behavior, right? So that's already a cost which is often now covered by researchers, by the university, and in a way by taxpayers' money to do that, or the consultants you pay to think about that, to test about that. So let's say you want less people to take their car driving into the city. There is already a tax or these just fees that you have to pay if you want to register your car to drive in the city. Well, one thing is it's much easier and much cheaper to just make that, I don't know, $10 more expensive every trip you go, and it has a much bigger change on behavior than trying to come up with any nudges and then trying to target them correctly. So when we think about, okay, there's no tax at all there, then a nudge might be better in some cases, or maybe it would be easier also to implement a nudge on a small scale, while implementing a tax on a small scale is just for legal reasons a bit harder to do. But there's many situations where probably just having a tax or increasing that tax is far easier than trying to come up with a nudge. But one thing where I think the importance comes in between these policy instruments like taxes versus nudges is that if we cannot always target the people who are, especially in this environmental case, creating the externality. So let's say I want kids, I did an experiment with children at schools to reduce their food waste. I cannot tax these kids, right? I cannot go and give me your lunch money because you threw away these peas. Probably not feasible. And if I tax the school, then they will still have to do something to somehow reduce the food waste. And so I cannot immediately tax those people who are causing the externality. A person who takes their car to work into the city, that's different because there I can immediately target them. So I think that's, again, the question about nudging is never better or worse, but we have to think about what's already there in the infrastructure and what is then the appropriate instrument to target that person. And then maybe if it is a lot of work to set up, but it might be the only way to do it, because there is maybe no other way to regulate that. I mean, we can't put kids into jail because they didn't eat up their lunch, right? So there's like using those type of regulations also doesn't work. And if we tried information before, then maybe nudging is the only way to try to move forward on that.
I mean, you can put kids in timeout. I guess it's the kid equivalent of jail.
Yeah, but then you might, and also the like follow through with it, right? Even with other things. So even let's say adults doing another project on food waste right now, and I mean, it's very hard. How are you supposed to go into people's households and figure out if they threw away? Let's take something like milk. How do you want to know that if somebody poured their milk down the drain? I mean, you want to install cameras into people's households next to their sink. So that's exactly. So that's never going to be feasible. So it's never something we can tax. Obviously, we can try to tax individual households' trash collection and see whether they recycled or not. So I'm not saying there's no possibilities here, but if you look at food waste, well, then I just put my food waste into the regular bin instead of the organic bin, and then also nobody's the wiser because who's going to go through all my trash to figure out if I threw away old potato?
The average rat or raccoon, but I'm not sure they give good testimony.
Yeah, I'm quite glad there are some limits on observability.
Yeah.
Even though as a researcher, I've often been like, God, why can't I just directly observe this? I mean, medication adherence is one of those ones where it's such an important behavior, and yet it's really difficult to directly observe unless you're going to, spend money on lots of electronic monitoring systems or get access to pharmacy data, which can be extremely difficult. I guess, I mean, how would you get around that? Do you tend to rely on self-reported data or a mix of like objective sort of proxy measures and subjective data? Is there an approach that you tend to prefer?
So I think the best one I've seen in the literature is when people actually have to take pictures of the pills. So they have some app and then they should take a picture of the pill because, of course, they still need to take it afterwards, but you can kind of assume if they took it out of the box, put it on their hand, send in a picture, it's quite likely they're also going to take it. So I think that's probably the best one of figuring out whether people took it. And then these studies were, after a while, obviously with some medication easier to see than with others, whether people are taking it, right? If you take a blood pressure reducing medication, it should show up in your blood pressure. So with other things, like in our case, iron supplements, that's going to be a much longer period and much harder to measure. So we also decided in our study, which is across all of South Africa, that would never be feasible it would have been pretty much every woman in the country, and then to measure all the blood levels at different times, and that was nothing that was feasible for us. So we use self-reported data, but in our paper, it was also much more important to see how do people react to reminders. Do they like them or not like them? So whether they actually take the medication is more of a secondary outcome for us. It's interesting to see what they say, but that's not really what we're analyzing. So we're analyzing how are they interacting with the reminders? Are they willing to receive more reminders? Of course, we look at do their self-reported adherence change? And since we randomize the different groups and there's not so much within the reminders why we would think they should report differently necessarily in these groups. So intrinsic, but of course that's an assumption. But yes, that's definitely our project in that way. It's not a medical project measuring that, but it's more of a project about public policy through these types of tools and what are the costs and benefits of doing that for the individual.
That's really, really cool, really interesting.
Well, I'm actually quite curious. It's a question, but I don't actually know to what extent you can talk about this, but how affiliated with nudges is your work at Impactually? Is your work still targeting nudges there, or is it a very different aspect of behavioral science that you're applying in your consultancy work?
Mm-hmm. So intentionally, we made Impactually not a nudging company because I also think that nudging is just part of behavioral science, but often it is a good way to apply it. And in many cases, especially in Sweden, where we mostly work, there is also a large interest to do studies together with nudging. So it is something that we are definitely using in our work, but also even when I give courses on nudging, I will usually say, okay, nudges are this part, and then there's also behaviorally informed incentives, and there's so many other things one can do. So I don't think we would ever have a project that would say, okay, we need to do nudging here, so let's figure out how we can do nudges. So we usually use this, our boost model. So it's like we define the behavior, and then we want to understand the obstacles, and then design an intervention that fits, which we then test in an experiment and scale up. And of course, it can happen that in many cases, maybe a nudge would be the right thing to do at that point. But it can also come out that it's actually a technological barrier, or there's a lack of information, or maybe that actually there do need to be different types of incentives. So I think that really goes from project to project, where we then try to apply really what makes sense there. And I definitely also with my type of training or what I do at the university or in research, I'm not stuck to it having to be nudging. A study I did with the transport agency that was also comparing nudges to economic incentives. And let's just say there, the economic incentives won out big time compared to the nudge. And then if I think that's the best way forward, then that's also what we should do.
Yeah, fair play. This seems cool. So we tend to end on a very nice, broad, philosophical, some type of projecting question. So I know as an economist, you might not thoroughly enjoy this question because I know the average economist opinion on trying to predict the future. But we always tend to ask, where do you see the future of behavioral science going, say, in the next 5 to 10 years? And I think for you specifically, because you're such an expert, I would also like to know where you think nudging is going to go in the next 5 to 10 years. Are we going to see more sludges and crudges and fudges or whatever version of udge we end up making up?
Yes. So maybe coming to where do I see nudging going, or are there going to be bad sides of nudging? Or I think trying to influence behavior is something we've been doing for years, right? In the 70s, lots of things with marketing, the way websites are designed. I think that's not new. And now just because the term nudging became quite popular out of the rise of the behavioral insights team and other things, and just a lot of people interested with that. I think nudging will always be there because it's a part of behavioral science, but maybe it's going to be a less of a in-word necessarily, and we're going to get a little bit better at using it, but hopefully starting a bit less to try to define it as much. As you've heard my opinion, I think it's a broad category, and there's things that are within it interesting or not, but I think trying to find all these subcategories and giving it different names, personally, I don't think there's a lot of benefit to that. What I would like to see much more is more meta studies and this robustness testing. Okay, what are things, under which circumstances do these nudges or nudges itself make sense? Under which circumstances are other policy tools or other things more important? Is it really about changing the environment, or are there situations where it's actually about changing the person, right? Changing motivation, or maybe the work like psychologists do about changing maybe how people see the world, beliefs, not in the economic way, but in the maybe psychology type of terms. And I think I think nudging has a lot of potential, or behaviorally informed solutions, and we're going to see more of that. But I personally, and that's also what I'm working a lot on, is trying to see, okay, where are the limits? Where are possible spillover effects? How robust is this? When we think about welfare calculations, do we need to take these psychological aspects into those calculations, and not just do we see people eating more apples or not, but what else is going on around it? And that's something I'm hoping. I think that's probably more going to come from the academic side, because there's still also on the academic side a lot of work to do on those questions. So maybe on the practical side, my thought would be that probably the people who know what they're talking about and they're really going to rise up, and then the ones who have a harder time with it are probably at some point going to move on to maybe something else that's in, or that they fancy when it's not so much of a hype anymore. But when it actually comes down to the very exhausting, very boring work, I mean, the South African study or similar studies have taken 5-6 years or something to run them, and I think it's important to take that time sometimes, but it's maybe not something that is a quick consultancy thing within 3 weeks.
No, absolutely not.
Well, you've been doing some amazing work, and on that vein of looking to the future, I'm so excited to see what comes next, and pushing the frontier and understanding the mechanisms and getting to grips really with the spillovers and everything that nudge can offer. And if the listener I mean, undoubtedly the listener would love to find out more about your work. Where can they find you? Is there anywhere on social media that you're active, or maybe a more academic a point of contact?
Yes, so I'm quite active on Twitter actually. So that's C_A_Gravert as my tagline. So you can definitely find me there. Then, of course, our website at Impactually also has some articles we've written, also links to a lot of the maybe other types of media appearances we had. So I think that is definitely on the maybe more popular science side. I also occasionally write for the behavioural so there's going to be a couple of articles, some new ones coming out also in the next couple of weeks. And academically, of course, you can find me on my Google Scholar profile if you want to go into the nitty-gritty of my research papers as well, or check out my website, which is just ChristinaGravert.com.
We'll link everything down below to reduce as much friction as possible for people to follow those links.
Oh yes, we will make it very, very easy.
Great.
Well, thank you so much, Christina, for your time. We have had so much fun talking to you about all the amazing work that you've been doing, and thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for having me. And thanks for the great work, podcast you're doing. I mean, it's really, I know it's a lot of effort, but it's definitely appreciated for the community.
So that was us talking to Christina, and I think I've learned a lot more about nudge, maybe slightly more a contextualized version of what nudge is and what it isn't, which I'm quite happy about. Sarah, what did you think?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I really actually liked Christina's way of defining nudge by talking about what nudge isn't, because that's always been a little bit of a question mark in my brain as to what are we actually talking about when we're talking about nudges. Like, is it a set, a small set of predefined tools, or is it about the setting, or is it about the application? So I really like that, and I'm a huge fan of Christina's work, especially the fact that she's asking questions about the welfare effects of nudges. I find that absolutely fascinating, just from a philosophical point of view, as to when to use and implement this tool, and actually taking into account far more in the equation than just your predetermined outcome. Is it a net gain or a net loss? So yeah, really cool stuff.
Yeah, no, I think these are, especially when you're looking at policy, because it's directly targeted towards improving welfare, that this is a consideration that, I read the white papers and I read the glossy reports to the extent that they're available to the public, obviously. And I'm always like, I feel like we're lacking some information here. Like, I know there is no real thirst for long-term studies, and that maybe that's just my niche, because I want to see if this does something in like a week, a month, a year. And that is something I find very interesting with nudges, where they work very much in the moment, and they might not have the carryover or future temporal effects that you were hoping for. But I mean, there's many worse things that a nudge can do. So it can also completely backfire. But I'm glad to have seen that within Christina's work, nothing has explicitly backfired. I think her work is very, very detailed. I mean, I think if there's anyone who knows a lot about nudges and what they can and can't do, I think it would be her. But I think it was a really, really interesting discussion. And I think I'm going to invest more in setting reminders on my phone, because, I do forget a lot of stuff. And they do seem to be very effective. Although I'll just guilt trip myself through my reminders. I won't add additional information. Important things, important differences.
Yeah, I really actually, that sort of framework of thinking about nudges as I think Christina sort of refers to them as pure nudges and moral nudges in one of her papers, is really interesting. This distinction between a nudge that provides moral utility or disutility, through providing people with information, which makes them feel bad or makes them feel good, and therefore affects their behavior. The difference between that sort of nudge and a nudge which people wouldn't really notice, it doesn't draw your attention If you're not looking for the nudge, you wouldn't really see it, such as like switching a default or adjusting the position of items within choice architecture. It's really interesting. I think that could be the key to helping us understand which nudges are going to have longer medium-term effects, which nudges are going to fizzle out, and also, where the spillover effects and the unintended consequences are more likely to be. So it poses, interesting questions, interesting ethical questions about the fact that, you may be manipulating people's behavior without them realizing what you're doing. I mean, I guess you could say that about lots of other types of policy tools potentially, but something about nudges and behavior change and choice architecture feels a bit more like a moral, ethical, dark grey area to me. So I think it's important that we keep having these conversations for sure.
No, absolutely. I think that's a really, really good point. I do remember there being an ethical framework for nudging. I think it's called For Good. Literally just all caps FORGOOD. I'm going to look up who one of the authors is of that, and maybe we should have a discussion with them. I do think that would be an interesting contrast to all the stuff we've already discussed about the practical applications and more the philosophical applications of nudge. Guys, as always, this is the end of it. I think we've had an absolutely great chat, so thank you so much, Christina, for making the time. We think both you and Nurit, because she is your colleague in Impact, actually, that we think you're an absolutely great bunch. So thank you so much for making the time. As always, this episode was hopefully educational, entertaining, thought-provoking, useful, maybe even. We don't know. We hope so. And as always, there will be one again next week. We hope you have a lovely week, and we hope to see you next week. And I think that was too much week for one sentence. Anyway, do let us know on our social media. Do please interact with us and let us know what you think about nudge, because it seems that everyone has an opinion, and opinions can be very wide-ranging, and we're just curious to see what camp you're in. Are you pro-nudge, anti-nudge, or sometimes you nudge and sometimes you do not nudge?
Nudge neutral.
All is fine. Nudge neutral. I love it. Well, guys, thanks so much for listening, and have a good one.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the